as I already told you, and I hope it's going to work with the sound. I had never had a problem with Zoom, but let me know if you don't hear anything. Don't wait for too long. I'm using something that teachers or pedagogues like to call something of a silent impulse, but actually this one isn't silent at all. So this is about impact the musical. The main thing here is take this in, and later on we're going to discuss a little bit of what your impressions are, right? So no specific questions that I want you to tease out. Just sort of take it in and share a couple of reflections on what you've seen.
And focusing on what money buys instead of buying into financial lies. There could be more to what our capital does. We started saving up for what will save us. We redefine what money is and can do. We thought of capital as energy too. We thought of cash in a completely new vein. We utilized our funds for impact, not gain. Over the past centuries, a group of old men said that all these hard-earned dollars should be used to garner masses of mass wealth. No, only one's own self. Except for they make equity, but now we see the world they need for us to change. Where our spare change is invested, lasting future ages. Our planet falls to dust. Their planet will combust. So we must do this task, which is to ask what if all sectors could unite with one view in mind. Public and private entities were combined. Profit and not-for-profit had the same goal. Pardon with dollars made you part of a whole. We reframed how we see our capital health. Value of money isn't money itself. We coin new ways for coins to appreciate. Appreciation meant, hey, that's really great. Tooling to reality is our reality. But realistically, think more holistically of what's in our head. We should lock it up, it's not enough. Don't trust these types of claims. It's illusion. Capital could be fuel for all to be free. Equity only equals equality. Equity make more than just building a set. We could build something bigger with all that cash. We put back into the world all that we can. Our concept of gaining will truly refrain. We started investing to make the world strong. We utilize the concept.
This video has been sponsored by The Purpose of Capital.
Okay, I'll stop it here and switch to a short reflection on, what you've just seen. I mean, any kinds of reactions that you might have, did you like it? Did you dislike it? What was the main message? Did you think that was a clever kind of thing in relation to impact? Yeah, Uwe, go ahead.
What I thought of as interesting in the video is that, well, usually what you hear in society is that the whole system, like of capitalism, has to change. And in this video, it was rather the way of how we interact with the system, or what we make of it, so to speak. So that was kind of refreshing to rather hear that perspective than the whole break the system thing.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks very much, Uwe. Who else? Yeah, Philip, please.
Yeah, I think the combining of private and public firms was interesting because, I mean, if we look at the history, for example, the DDR, I mean, it might not have all worked out in the past. However, it still could be an option and could still be interesting if it's done differently, maybe.
Mm-hmm. So this idea of sort of merging things, Uwe, you were saying reinterpreting things, right? How we do it, there's a design space in here, right? What else? Yeah, Roman, go ahead.
I think the video kind of also showed that there doesn't need to be any compromises when it comes to prosperity. But when you go for an impact-oriented enterprise, not a profit-oriented enterprise, it can still bring prosperity, but not only to one person, but to everyone.
Right. So I think this is sort of taking up some of the themes. Did anyone else say something? Or was that just an accidental unmute? Okay, so I think what it basically it does, of course, and you've observed that, Roman, is that it takes up this sort of whole story around, maybe you can design an enterprise or an organization around a sustainability challenge, really manage for greatest impact, and then maybe sort of the contradictions and maybe the trade-offs are going to resolve themselves to some degree, right? And we're seeing, I think, in your course projects that there are some possibilities to actually do this. And on the other hand, we also see that there's a continued struggle in terms of, how to make this work. And I think we had these discussions around, is an impact model different from a business model? And how do you get them to be calibrated in a way that, this is really working on a major scale, so to say, right? So let me jump into the presentation and share a couple more reflections on this before we invite Oscar and Nikolai in. So the subject of today, as you might have guessed, is impact. By the way, the sort of this musical was produced by a guy called Jed Emerson, who's also the author of the book that you saw in the end, which is open access, so he doesn't gain anything from you getting that book, The Purpose of Capital. He's been in the field for quite some time, very influential on impact and impact measurement as well. And sort of at some point he paired up with his niece, who's the singer and apparently a Hollywood actress with some kind of a minor role, I think, in the Hunger Games. And then they had this idea of, we need to transmit the idea of impact and this vision to a larger, group of the population and make it fashionable to some degree as well, and maybe show alternatives, as Uwe was saying, possibilities to maybe also work more intensely at the sort of this perceived border between public and private, and how we could change the way that we look at things, but also putting impact front and center, right? So that was the main message in the sense of, maybe we should shift from prioritizing capital and profits only, and instead, focus on impact creation, right? So what we can certainly observe here is that impact is basically all around, right? I'm just giving you a couple of snapshots, some of the things you've already seen in previous lectures. So the first thing, which was quite remarkable, is Larry Fink, who was BlackRock CEO, the biggest investment company in the world. All of a sudden, I think it was in 2019, was calling for positive contributions to society, and that CEOs should change their ways of, basically behaving and thinking about organizational strategy. We've already mentioned this B Corporation certification, where the focus is really on organizations creating benefit for society. And it was quite remarkable that Danone some years ago has announced that they wanted to transform all their subsidiaries, and I'm always stressing that because it's not about part of the organization, but Danone, this huge global corporation as a whole, into certified B Corps, which is quite a signal in terms of, we're taking impact and social value creation seriously. Then, as a third observation, there are new types of finance. You might have seen this in the context of the AIR move, where we're talking about impact investing a lot as well, less so here, but in terms of, having financing that has a focus on creating, as Roman was also saying, sort of these returns for society in a sense, right? Not only for, shareholders or for the organizations or even for customers, but looking more broadly. And there have been global steering. There's been a global steering group and is a global steering group and national representative bodies on impact investing. So it's also at the mixture of kind of field building, institution building, and national policy, in fact. And the fourth one is, and that's closest to our idea of, impact is important, but also assessing it, measuring it is important in order to, make sense of whether an organization, and in your cases, the course projects, are actually changing something in a positive way in society. The fourth aspect here is that people at Harvard and elsewhere are working on something that they call impact-weighted accounts, where they are really implementing this idea of impact into some kind of accounting standards and whatever organizations are reporting more broadly. And that's where I'll be handing over to Oscar.
Hello there. I'd like to talk a bit about the aspect of how difficult it is to put this all into practice. So while there are some advancements in the discussion about achieving net zero and how to proceed, how companies can proceed further, and this is also something that we debated during the last class 2 weeks ago, where one of you raised the idea of greenwashing as one big challenge in the scaling aspect. I would like to show you in a bit more detail an initiative called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is an practice that large banks worldwide, especially Western European banks, committed itself to align its portfolio of assets towards net zero by 2050 pathway, which means that not only their emissions of the portfolio, of the whole portfolio, should be close to zero by 2050, but this also means that these current investments or loans provided by the banks towards companies or mortgages, for instance, should be in alignment with net zero scenarios. So, for instance, for the housing sector, this means decreases of over 30 or 40%, even depending on the scenario, by 2030, and the total CO2 emissions of the new building stock, which also means that obviously banks will have to look at the impact its investments have, and also measure this. So this means by scope 3 emissions, which I will tell a little bit more later on. But unfortunately, I'm also a person working in one of the financial institutions. We are not as the financial sector there. So as you can see on the graph on the right side, actually the colors are twisted here, so it is a little bit strange to interpret, but the investments in the fossil fuel industry are only by 2021. They are starting to get similar to the investments in the green projects, let's say in the industry of green investments. But as you can see, even since 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, still the investments in the fossil fuel sector were way higher than within green projects. So you can see a certain degree of acceleration, which is a good thing. And I can assure you that many people are, let's say, doing their best to increase that ratio. But there's also a very large, let's say, heritage of black or how could we call them, dirty assets, these coal assets, oil assets, gas assets that are not considered to be, let's say, on the green side. And what I would like to tell here with this story is that this is a process that is unfortunately ongoing. It is not going as fast as probably many of us would wish, so that we could slash our investments within a few years. But it is unfortunately also a little bit a chicken or egg dilemma, and this is something I'm not absolutely trying to water down the responsibility of the financial sector, but also portray that the financial sector is a sector that finances the economy. So it is kind of, let's say, following what the market is doing. And as banks or other financial institutions can, for instance, as BlackRock said, quit investments in the most dirtiest assets, it is also a position where these assets are still to be financed, let's say. So, for instance, our current economy still requires, unfortunately, the exploitation of new gas and oil fields. So, the question is rather like if somebody will finance it. This is fueling our future emissions, but from the other side, the financial sector has this role in this opportunity to say no to financing, and this is a process which is slowly ongoing, and this is also shaping the economy. And I think that this graph on the right side is let's say, working from both sides. So from the one side, you can see that financial entities are slowly but surely increasing the pressure, let's say, on financing fossil fuel investments. But from the other side, also the market is changing. So, for instance, renewable energy sources are cheaper and cheaper and more competitive towards fossil fuels, which makes, let's say, the new investments in fossil fuels less profitable than the green projects. So that is these are, let's say, the two reasons: the chicken and egg. It's a little bit hard to tell which is more important, but both aspects. So the pressure of the financial sector, but also, let's say, the changing economic environment are pushing towards a change. And if I might ask for the next slide. I would like to also discuss a little bit in this context of how institutions are changing and how we could really consider whether all these promises that companies are making, that we already discussed a bit 2 weeks ago, excuse me, and as Georgis has shown 2 slides ago. There are a few questions that I think all of you can ask when you see a new, let's say, green product, green solution, green approach towards business. You can ask yourself a few questions. So first, can you generally consider the business model of the company to be sustainable? So looking looking at the example of a financial sector, you can claim from one side that is fueling growth. So growth by definition of many, let's say, definitions of post-growth aspects is considered to be, let's say, unsustainable by itself, because it is not, it is fueling exponential growth. But from the other side, you could also claim that the financial sector might finance a sustainable transition. So it is difficult to tell, but whether if you have a product, let's say a plastic bottle with water that is made out of recyclable plastic or plastic that is biodegrading, then I think the problem with the bottle itself is that the product itself is not really a sustainable business model by itself. And a second question is more about the reputation of the company. So we have a company that has been on the, let's say, on the less sustainable side for a long time, and suddenly it comes out with a huge campaign showing everything in green colors and promoting the sustainability approach. Then you might ask yourself whether this is not suspicious, right? That somehow these companies, are they really changing, or are they just pretending that they are changing? So, for instance, I think a good example are oil and gas companies that present that they are fueling, or let's say financing the transition of towards sustainable energy sources. This is something that the largest companies do. I'm not gonna place specific names, but I'm sure that many of you have come around such advertisements made by the largest oil and gas companies globally. And actually, when we later look at it, it doesn't turn to be part of the core business. So the core business of an oil and gas company is still dig for new oil and gas and to pump as many liters of that as possible. And quite often, unfortunately, the let's say the transition branches of these companies are only a small part of its business. And this is also changing. You can see some shifts among these large entities, but still absolutely the fundamental part of these companies is really still digging fossil fuels. So the question is also like, does this green transition, this green innovation of a specific product, does it also impact the fundamentals of the company? So is it really a material issue? So for instance, if we have a company that is dedicated to energy sources, it should rather really we should consider that a green transition would be going all into renewable energy sources or battery storage or house renovation, rather than let's say doing these renewable projects next to the large scale fossil fuels. And the last but not least, this is something that we discussed during the scaling module. Obviously, it's also about how to get to big scale. So if we have some CSR or even considered sustainability actions undertaken by a company, are they really, besides of being, let's say, the core business, are they also really scaling this up into the scale of the whole entity, or is it really something that is next to the core business, or is only, let's say, a small percentage of the whole market? And these are, I think, a few aspects that you can consider when thinking about the challenge of greenwashing, and how you can be relatively sure. Maybe how to be sure is a big word, but how to be relatively sure that you are, let's say, looking at these investments or these new innovations at something that is truly, let's say, sustainable, or as sustainable as it could be. So thanks.
Great. While switching over to Mikolaj, who's going to share his own slides, just two observations. The first thing is, obviously, there's also this danger in the musical, right? In the sense, right? This is something that's fashionable, something that is supposed to go mainstream, but there's always this discussion of, maybe it's losing its entire essence by becoming meaningless in a sense, right? So on the one hand, this is pushing more people into the right direction, ideally, and on the other hand, it might just be, too, without substance, maybe to be really focused on impact. And the second thing is that's why we're calling you to always think from the impact and the positive change that you want to create with your course projects, right? Really make sure that this is sort of the greatest impact that you can achieve towards the sustainability challenge. Don't worry too much about the business model side and so on. That's also important, but here we're really pushing you to go, for the biggest impact, instead of, tweaking something that's inherently unsustainable to something that's a bit more sustainable, right? And now I'll hand over to
thanks for this clarification details.
Yeah. Thank you, Jordi. Thank you, Oskar. I hope that you can see my slides. I'm always struggling.
All good. All good.
Yeah, all good. Okay. What I'm intending to do in that, my part of today's lecture, is to bring some insights from policy studies, where we are also very much interested in measuring the impact of policies or social interventions. So basically, we are quite often talking about very similar phenomena if we want to measure the impact of business models and when we want to measure the impact of policies. So if we think about the policy cycle, where you first think what is the problem, we set the agenda, then we formulate our solutions to that problem, make final decision, then we are implementing it. And usually the fifth element of the cycle is what we call evaluation. Yes, and evaluation is actually measuring the impact of a policy or project or program or intervention, and trying to see if the efforts that we made in order to deal with the problem were effective, if we achieved what we wanted to do, or maybe why not we didn't achieve it, why this program or the innovation did work. What's always raised by this field of research in which we evaluate the policies, that it's a very important element of democracy. Ernest Haus, the classic researcher from the field of evaluation of policies, is saying that actually it is element of deliberative democracy. As he said three principles. First, we think we need, when measuring and discussing impact of our innovations, we should think about inclusion, with whom we are discussing it, whose interests are represented in these discussions. Are all stakeholders affected by such innovation are taken into account. Then we should design a dialogue in which we are discussing about it. Dialogue, as a dialogue, I understand the exchange of our views about what has happened, what change was achieved thanks to the innovation. Do we secure procedures of controlling the power imbalances? Are people exchanging their authentic views, or they are just performing lip service when we discuss about the impact? And the third element, the third principle, is the principle of deliberation. Is this deliberation reflexive? How well considered is the deliberation? And by deliberation, I understand reaching common agreement how to measure the impact, what conclusions to bring together, understanding that we are different stakeholders, differently looking at this issue, but needing to make a final decision together. Okay, now I think it's going to be a bit postmodern element of this lecture. Now I want to show you a video with Georgie. Okay, I hope that it's going to be visible for you. Let me share my screen again. And now not the presentation, but the video. Okay.
The main challenge of impact measurement is that different stakeholders
just
have
let me know if you're able to hear also, yeah?
Expectations as to, one, how it should be applied, and two, what it should be used for. How to reconcile these expectations is what we'll discuss here. In impact measurement, there are 4 different stakeholder groups. The first one are impact investors, venture philanthropists, and social finance institutions. The second is science and research. The third, social ventures, and the fourth, policy. Let's start with the finance world and investors. What they want is to have information quickly in order to make and adapt investment decisions. Ideally, they want to make decisions across a portfolio of investment. Science and research, in turn, want to dive in deeply and apply robust research designs and methods to really make sure whether impact has been achieved and how this has happened. Social ventures should assess their impact for the sake of organizational learning, that is, to improve their interventions, services, or products. Ideally, they want to use impact information to spot where and how they can best innovate. Finally, policy's interest is to get a comprehensive overview as to what the best solutions for social problems are. In the best of cases, this information is used to design policy frameworks that are in harmony with the needs of the most successful social ventures. So you see, each of these stakeholder groups has very different priorities, but there are also common interests that can help reconcile their requirements. First, all stakeholders have an interest in contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. These span from alleviating poverty to achieving gender equality. Second, all would like to see some move towards standardization in order to be able to compare impacts. But most stakeholders also recognize that impact assessments often need to be tailored to the ventures assessed and their context conditions. And third, all want to find out what has improved. And not only that, they also want to investigate why it happened and seek to make sure that the investigated organization was actually responsible for it. This leads to 4 key recommendations. First, inspired by science and research, analysts of impact need to make sure they don't apply any half-baked approaches. If impact measurement is practiced that way, you can't say with certainty what has happened, not to speak of who was responsible for it. Rather than go half-baked, don't assess impact at all. Inspired by the portfolio idea of investors, impact analysts need to take a variety of information on board. Don't try to collapse information into a single figure or ratio, but go for what we call dashboard approaches, which bring together different perspectives and also kinds of data, which, by the way, can be quantitative or qualitative. To enable organizational progress and innovation, impact measurement needs to move from proving to improving. This means impact measurement needs to become a continuous process that is used for questioning and reflection. These instances can help organizations redefine goals or choose different pathways. Following the comparative perspective of policy, impact measurement always needs to be performed with a relative rather than an absolute view in mind. There is no one best solution. Instead, there are better and worse ones. To decide on that and to evolve over time, context needs to be taken into account. One intervention might work better under certain circumstances than under others. Taking these 4 guideposts into account when you design your impact assessment and execute it will help you make sure that you account for the complexity of impact to the right extent, establish a reliable basis for decision-making, take all relevant, but also not too much information into account, and most importantly, this way, your impact assessment will actually help you grow social impact.
Okay, thank you, Georgie, for that. And we can come back to this, to thinking what actually impact is, or what are the various levels of the outcomes of our intervention. I find it the most difficult problem for many people who start dealing with measuring their impact. And here I would like to again bring two insights. One is from the logic model of social impact, from the paper we'll suggest you to read before this working group session we will have next week. And another one is taken from the evaluation of interventions framework recommended for many years by European Commission to evaluate how structural funds of European Union are invested in various member states. So on the first level, we could think about something which is an output, a product of our intervention or of our business plan. So it's something immediate, something which is measurable, something we will control, something we control. Let's think about an idea that people from 5 universities decided to have a course for students from 5 universities. They titled Transform. They decided to teach them about sustainability and entrepreneurship. And the output of this innovation would be a group of students who will pass the class. They will receive some knowledge, some competences, hopefully some skills. Yes, and we can give them grades, maybe some kind of certification that we have that output. We are very happy that we have that output. But what's very interesting for us is actually what you are going to do with that knowledge, competences, and skills. And this we usually call outcomes or results. Yeah, so what are going to be medium-term effects? Are you going to use it to improve your project, business plans you're going to create outside of the university? How are you going to actually use that knowledge? Yes, and the most interesting level, the highest level over which we have the smallest control is actually if your usage of this knowledge, competences, and skills from this class is going to have an impact on other people. This is what we call impact actually. And of course, it's always the easiest to measure the outputs of our interventions, of our projects, but what we are interested most is the impact. And quite often our innovations, they might have even unintended consequences. So we might be very happy with the output, but actually the impact on the world outside might be not that satisfying our presumptions about what we are projecting. One example I like very much is the policy implemented by the city of Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. A few years back, they decided in order to reduce the usage of cars in the city, and reduce the smog in the city, they introduced a policy of free tickets for public transportation. And they were very happy with the output because less people started using cars. Okay, so we can say it was a success of that policy. Less people were using cars. I think, well, maybe it was not impressive decrease of the car usage, but it was nearly 5%. But there was also another outcome of this intervention. Many people who were previously walking in the city for the short distances, they started using public transportation because it was for free. Before, they didn't want to buy a ticket just to ride 1 or 2 stops. But when the public transportation became free, they started using it. So their health started deteriorating because even the small amounts of physical exercises, walking for 10 minutes from one place to another, especially it was affecting kids who were not traveling to their schools or kindergartens by foot, but they started using public transportation. And the number of people commuting in the city or moving in the city by foot dropped by 8%. So it was a larger number of people who stopped using the previous way of moving in the city thanks to that policy. So we could be very happy with the output that the number of people using cars dropped, but also there was larger negative impact of this policy. Let's now move to discussing what actually we could assess, because there is various elements we could assess. This figure might be looking a bit complicated, but I will focus on various points in it. I will try to discuss 5 criteria or 5 elements, various elements we could assess when talking about our innovations or our interventions. I see that someone is okay. Thank you, Georgie, for the link. First thing we could discuss the relevance of our intervention, which would be the relation between the needs and the objective of our business plan. Yes, so actually, are we meeting these needs with the targets or objectives of what we would like to propose? What's interesting and important to remember, this could be measured before the actual planning. Yes, we sometimes call this evaluation ex-ante evaluation. Yes, we could do research, we could make research about previous similar projects or policies to think if our objectives are actually meeting the needs. And we call this criterion relevance. So if it is appropriate, our explicit objectives are meeting the problem, the needs of our audience to whom we want to propose it. Next, we could focus on what we call effectiveness. And this is usually in evaluation studies, the most focus is on effectiveness. If we have the objectives, if actually we achieved our objectives through the input and activity we taken. So we look at results and impact, and we think if actually we did what we planned. Yes, we call it effectiveness. Sometimes the biggest mistake, and quite often we see it, especially in case of public intervention, is that the effects, output, results, or impact is measured by input. Very often we can meet it, this situation. It sounds ridiculous, but my favorite example is the Polish Science Agency funding our research grants, who is at the end of every year very happy saying that we spend billions of zlotys funding research and this is a great success. But maybe this research was, was not bringing any, even not any output, or maybe the results were stupid, but they are happy presenting the input, what assets they engage in achieving. So it's I would say it's the biggest mistake when talking about measuring impact. Okay, we could also talk about efficiency. And for the ones who studied business schools, who studied management, it is probably very familiar criterion talking. Actually, maybe we could do these things cheaper, or they could be done at more reasonable costs, achieving these outputs or results of our intervention. But the most important elements, criterions of discussing the measurement of impact is a criterion we called utility. So actually, if the impact of our innovation is meeting the social needs we previously diagnosed. And of course, we could also talk about sustainability. Here, sustainability is understood in a bit different way. So in sustainable, well, not exactly the broad concept of sustainability, which is guiding our class. Here, sustainability is for how long the impact of our intervention is lasting in time. So often the rule of thumb in public policy evaluation is actually conducting research 2 years after the project was closed, yes, to see if the effects of that project are still durable. So in case of our class, we could invite you in 2 years and ask the question, do you still remember all the things we were discussing during this class? And if you would be able to pass the test in 2 years, we could say, yes, it was really sustainable, innovative project. Okay. I think now we should turn to Georgie. Yes, so I will stop my presentation and it's going to be your call, Georgie, yeah?
Yeah. Okay, I'll take over from Mikolai now again, and would like to really build directly on what Mikolai was saying in terms of, getting to sort of the biggest stretch, right? From what's relevant to, is it actually happening, right? I already mentioned that at the very beginning. This is often called a theory of change, right? A theory of change means that you really in detail think about how do you move from one step to the next, and especially how do you get from what you're actually doing as an organization to the impact that you want to see. You will recognize again this sort of narrative that I was mentioning earlier in relation to your course projects. You can also see it the other way around, right? So you define the impact and then you deduct what you need to do in order to actually get there, right? So whenever you have an organization, you usually won't have just one impact chain or one sort of theory of change. Ideally, things would be interconnecting, but maybe you have separate ones, and it may involve different stakeholders, right? I want to give you an example here, and I already shared the link in the chat, so you can maybe download this because you can then see it a bit better than on the screen. It's quite small, but what I want to present, is the theory of change of the Rainforest Alliance, and especially its UTZ scheme, which is a certification program for sustainable farming. And sustainable farming, you will see, involves a number of things, right? It involves the health of the farmers. It involves obviously sort of sustainable and ecological farming practices, and so on. So maybe either you download it or you look at it on the screen. But as I said, I couldn't make it any bigger to fit the screen. And then, just take maybe 30 seconds of individual reflection on, what does this tell us? What does it help us understand about the impact of UTZ? Well, actually, it's not that small. I think you can even read it on the screen. So I suggest this time I won't stop the presentation because it's, I think, quite nice to look at it at the same time. So if you want to speak up, you will either need to raise your hand. So I hope that you're popping up so that I see you, or you just start talking, and we're going to sort it out in case several people talk, right? So my question is really here, what does this help you understand about this UTZ scheme? What are things that are potentially confusing? What are the limitations? What kind of critiques do you have about this way of, displaying a theory of change? Anyone? Too confusing? It could be just basic things. I mean, reflecting on or telling us what exactly tells you, what kind of things are puzzling, what you don't get, what's confusing to you. Really, no one? Yep, fantastic. Philip, go for it.
Yeah, I think in general it gives us a good structure on from beginning of the project, from the strategies, and then to see, okay, what do you want to achieve and what do you expect it to lead to? But what I was wondering is, why isn't there something included that maybe then includes the actual outcomes, and maybe something like a feedback loop or something, because things don't always turn out as you expect them to be. So that's what I think kind of misses, this kind of misses out on.
Yeah.
But the first thing is the first part is definitely good covered.
Yeah, fantastic. If someone else wants to come in, always just raise your hand. Yeah, Roman, please.
Yeah, it maybe complements a little bit what Philip just said, but I'm missing kind of how to measure these things.
Mm-hmm.
They are all stating where they want to contribute, and what they want to do, but it isn't stated like how to measure actually these results. Like, how to measure a healthy soil. What does it mean?
Yeah. Okay. So fantastic. Those are two great reflections. So, by the way, if you want to, dive more deeply into it, you already have the report. Yeah, Daniela, please.
Just adding to that, I think that's also what it took as well. I'm missing the how. I was trying to, and I don't know if I completely, but for the overflowing view, I think the how they are going to achieve it should be also more specific, more clear, like it should be tangible.
Yeah. No, very good observations. And what I first wanted to say, I mean, if you want to dive more deeply into how exactly they are assessing it and also how they're measuring it, you can have a look at the report. But totally, I mean, this is the step where you sort of conceptualize how you want to go about, or where you want to go, basically, and how things interconnect, right? But you're not very specific at this stage about, how exactly you're doing it or how exactly we're measuring it, right? We're going to move a little bit more into that direction today, but especially in the working session next week, right? Great observations in relation also to Philip, that, this helps us sort of get some kind of an overview, but it might be confusing to some extent. Maybe it's overboarded, right? So there's a bit too much information, maybe. And at the same time, this is all about, that's our projection. How do you, integrate this with potentially a feedback loop, and then gathering some data and potentially using it for, for organizational learning as well. That's also something that we're going to advance, especially in the next session, right? So what I want to warn you of is basically that we're in, a minute or two, we're going to throw you into your working groups, and without much further commentary, you're supposed to be drawing up some kind of a theory of change of your course project, right? It doesn't need to be, super advanced. You can focus on one thing, it can be very sketchy, just not more than 10 minutes, and then a little bit of, maybe 1 or 2 snapshot presentations from the groups, but really just trying to get into this mode of thinking, what exactly does what we're doing do, for who does it do something, and how could we assess whether we're actually making a change, right? So just a couple of summary points here. First of all, basically, do you basically see that there are some kinds of different pathways here. The ingredients that need to come together are defined. For instance, this worker safety, or these trainings on sustainable agriculture. But basically, there's also still a little bit of difficulties in relation to really teasing out what the story is on the UTZ theory of change, right? So how the different bits and pieces. Sorry, I think this slipped here. No. How the different bits and pieces are falling into place, right? So the idea here would be now that, again, without further commentary, we're going to throw you into your groups. You can take some of the stuff that we've provided you with as inspiration for, drawing up a first sketch of your own theory of change, right? So what do your course projects actually do? And for whom, and how could you potentially assess it? So what are relevant dimensions of impact for you? Coming back slowly. Dominika was already telling me that some of you were struggling with the complexity of the task, which is, I think, one of the learnings. It can be a much simpler kind of thing, but basically, without saying too much about it, I would just like to invite, maybe one or two groups of you to, even if you haven't drawn up anything, to just share some reflections on what this exercise of thinking about a theory of change for your course project did to you. Who would want to give it a go and share with the group?
I can talk about what we did in our group.
Yeah, please, Veronica.
I think overall for us, it was quite good to reflect on all of it. We actually did sort of draw up a little slide, but I think it was very good in having a look at sort of start to finish and like having quite a good picture on, and always like relating back to the actual impact you're going to make, because I think that's obviously a key part to it, and seeing the processes.
Did you guys want to share what you came up with in terms of a sketch? You don't have to, but
I can try.
Yeah, sure, go.
Okay. Share screen. There we go. Okay, this doesn't seem too complicated. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
So we had.
Gosh, that's more than a quick drawing. That's good.
It was very collaborative.
Yeah, we took the template from the internet to because also it was kind of like not an overview, so we needed the help.
Yeah. So we were talking about like the inputs. It's quite clear here, I think. There's inputs, outputs, and then like talking about the major impact. I think that was helpful for all of us. And also comparing the outputs to the outcomes and looking at the differences between what an output and outcome is, and how one's much more tangible and one's more philosophical almost. Yeah.
No, fantastic. I mean, this is almost speaking for itself in terms of, looking at things like changing social norms, making it stylish to sort of not buy new clothes, but instead, revamp what you have, and these kinds of things. And I think, and that also relates to discussions with some of the groups that I had, that I think will help you make the decisions on, what actual activities do we want to prioritize? Do we want to do something as a main kind of activity? Do we need an ancillary activity? Are those two balanced activities, depending on what your goal set is, basically, right? Fantastic, Veronica. I think this is really nice in terms of coming up with, the major building blocks and how those things interconnect, right?
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
Great. Is there anyone else who would like to share? So I don't want to cut it off directly. Just take this as a first step, right? Next week in the working session, we're going to use this and build on it. And in the remaining time that we have today, we're also going to be going a bit more into the idea of actual measurement and other concepts that can help you move from this theory of change to something that is more of a sort of even a research design to assess the kinds of impacts that you had. But I wouldn't want to cut anyone off. Was there anyone else who wanted to share? And it's not a problem if not. I think this was a really good example of how you can go about it, right? Okay, so there's also going to be another, you already see the links, so just as sort of a pre-announcement, in the chat, another quick exercise, not in the groups, just for individual reading, where we're going to tease out something that is more measurement related. But first of all, I'd like to hand it over to Mikolaj once again for introducing the SMART framework.
Okay, I guess that quite many of you are familiar with SMART framework for achieving goals. It is well known in the management field for, I think, nearly 40 years already, but it's still used. But what I would like to discuss in reference to SMART framework is how it is useful for designing your innovation with already thinking how to measure the impact of it. Yes, so SMART, it's an abbreviation for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So if you think about your goals, your objectives, they need to be specific. Yes, you have to clearly define what actually you would like to achieve in order to be able to measure it. And this is the second element, measurable. If you determine your goals, they have to be measured by clear indicators. Quite often they are quantified. Yes, so thanks to this, you can think about the research tools for your evaluation or impact measurement. When you think about achievable goals and you're answering the question, is it realistic to achieve these objectives? You can already think about it in terms of ex-ante evaluation. So preparing a kind of a diagnosis or assessment of impact before actually starting your innovation. The same it is with relevance. Yes, we already introduced you to the concept of evaluation criterion of relevance, when you're trying to see if the needs of your audience are matching the objectives of your innovation. Of course, sometimes when we talk about SMART framework, we're not talking about relevance, we're also talking about the realism of it, if it is realistic to achieve it. And finally, time bound. So if your goals are realistic in the time frame you're thinking about achieving them. Yes, you cannot change the world in 1 year. You cannot achieve the sustainability goals in half of a year. So this is relevant for planning of your innovation. One caveat I would like to make here when presenting it, there is a danger if you think about your goals in terms of measurement. On one hand, we would like to persuade you to think about something specific and something you can measure. But what we also know from various research, especially policy research, sometimes we focus too much on what is measurable. Yes, and then we are losing the sight of things which are maybe harder to be researched, but they are most important. So this is the problem with many organizations and many policies, that they're trying to achieve the goals which are easy to be quantified, easy to be measured. Yes? So there is always a kind of a trade-off. What is easy to be measured and what actually is the large objective of our innovation. Okay, thank you, Georgie.
Fantastic, Mikolaj. That's a super important remark here. And I think it also works nicely with what Veronica was just presenting, right? I love this sort of, we're changing social norms. Exactly, that's the point, right? So that's the thing that you're going to focus on. And now I'm trying to build or go one step further from this idea of SMART into something that can help you structure, your measurement approach, right? I'm going to give you an example that is COVID related and use a framework that comes from evidence-based healthcare. And then I'm going to, you've already seen the links in the chat. You can pick out one of those, right? Don't read all three. Those are very short reads, and the idea is also not that you go through the reads in detail, but that you are supposed to identify the PICO in the studies that you're going to review in a minute, right? So it's going to be a little bit of individual reading time and then a discussion in the whole group. So we're not putting you back into the groups. But first of all, I'd like to introduce you to this idea of PICO, right? So as I said, it comes from evidence-based healthcare, and this is basically how you do evidence-based healthcare study. And I made a COVID-19 example, well, because it's very relevant and also quite easy to take in terms of, what exactly is it, right? So first of all, PICO is interested in the participants, right? So if you think about this as almost an academic research project, if you're thinking about your impact as an academic research project, who would be the participants, right? Who exactly are you going to study? And you might need to make differences, right? You might also exclude certain stakeholders because it just gets too much, it's too complicated, it's too complex, it doesn't really make sense, right? So rather start small and be quite specific on who you're going to study. It's quite interesting. I already used this, when the pandemic was starting, this idea, and the age cohorts that I had at the beginning, which I totally made up without knowing what the exact studies would be, were different from what we have now, right? But basically, we know now that first of all, there was some kind of vaccine trials for participants 60 plus and sort of adults, right, from 19 to 59 years, with a priority on older people. Then there was later on, basically a further development for younger people, sort of youth, basically, and then for children, right? And there's still no vaccine for sort of 4 years and younger. That already shows us that you need to sort of differentiate between the target groups that you're assessing and also the studies that you're setting up in assessing whether the vaccine and whether this trial vaccine is actually effective, right? The intervention in this case, so what is supposed to cause the effect is, of course, the trial vaccines, right? The Moderna, the BioNTech, whatever it is that is being tested, that is the intervention, right? So you also know that from these studies where you give a placebo and you give a certain new medication, and then you want to see what happens, and that's the intervention. The comparator obviously is some kind of a control group that receives the placebo, no vaccine at all, in order to actually see what is the difference if this vaccine is here or is not here, right? So it might turn out that it has the vaccine has huge side effects. Then we're going into this area that Nikolai was mentioning earlier, right? So there might be unintended effects that you have, or it might prove to be sort of worthless in a sense and not really effective in preventing the outbreak of COVID. And the outcomes, and that's really quite the standard term in evidence-based healthcare and in the social sciences, that usually you're talking about final social outcomes instead of impact. So basically those are interrelated and interchangeable here. And obviously here in this case, it's two kinds of things that you could be looking at. It's the outbreak of sort of the disease, but it could also be, looking at, whether people get infected or not. By now, we know you can still get infected, although you have the vaccine. But, the hypothetical scenario would have been that, the vaccine prevents you even from getting infected, right? So you really go through in terms of who are you going to study? What is it exactly that you're doing? So be very specific about the activities, about your organizational activities. What are you comparing it to, right? So let's take the slow fashion and the reuse and recycling example that we had from before. So maybe you can, directly compare it to fast fashion, right? Or regular fashion, right? Maybe not sort of the throwaway labels, but those that, seem to be high quality, but, comparing it against that, or existing consumption patterns and the changed social norm in terms of reducing the consumption, right? And then the outcomes would be, we already mentioned, the social norms. We mentioned different kinds of, lifestyles, different kinds of behaviors in relation to the example that we had, right? So you can one-on-one almost refer those or transfer those kinds of ideas of the PICO to your course projects. What I'd like you to do now is take a bit of reading time, not too much. We don't have too much time left, but those are really short readings anyway. So take one of the examples that I'm giving here. I'll stop sharing so you have them already in the chat. Just go to one of those articles, screen through it, and then we're going to discuss a little bit what is the PICO, right? So that's the question. What are the participants? What is the intervention? What is the comparator? What are the outcomes in each of those studies? And you're free to choose whichever one you like, right? One is on community-oriented housing. The first one focusing mostly on elderly people. The second one is about political participation, and the third one about pro-social behavior in schools. It doesn't really matter which one you do. Just do one, go through it, and the main task here is to identify the PICO and not go any further. Yeah, I can share the slide with PICO. Participants, intervention, okay. Comparator, and outcomes. So Annika, does that mean that you did the one with the community-oriented housing? Just give it a try.
No, I did the other one with the politics.
Okay, that's fine. So what about that one then?
So regarding the participants and the study, so it was about Abgeordnetenwatch, which basically is like a political platform in Germany. So they currently have 120,000 users, and from then I think it was like 900 or so engaged in the study, and either they were citizens or people in the German parliament.
Yeah.
So these are the participants.
Yeah.
And the intervention was that, I don't know if I understand it now correctly, but in the study, they were asking them questions about how the use of the platform changed for example, for the citizens, their political engagement. And regarding the parliament members, they were also asked about the impact of the parliament, for example, on things like visibility. And
but what exactly is the intervention here? So now you're talking about the relevant outcomes, right? So you were talking about visibility or transparency, but what exactly is the intervention? Yeah, Daniela?
Yeah, like I think the intervention is like the engagement. They want to measure if it increases the engagement.
I mean, the intervention in this case is the platform itself, right? So people using the platform. So the existence or non-existence of the platform and the services that is bringing in is the intervention here, right? Do you have any, Daniela or Annika, do you have any idea about what the comparator was in the study? So what did I compare the existence of effects or non-existence of effects to? Roman?
I think it was the general German population. It was compared to like studies which were conducted beforehand about the general political orientation and interest in politics in general of the German population. Right,
exactly. So the comparator in this case was not someone doing something else, right, using some other platform, but it was just the general population, because, you know, the comparator here would be there's just no such platform and people are not using any kind of platform. They're just regular citizens, basically, right? And you already, Annika, fantastic, and Daniela, you already talked about some of the outcomes that I was looking at, and also that those were differentiated between the different participants, right? The citizens as well as the members of parliament. Maybe we can carry the community-oriented housing into as a start into the working session next week. I would still like to see whether someone went into sort of this study on pro-social behavior in schools, and whether you had any ideas on what the PICO was in relation to that. Yeah, Selina, please.
Yeah, I read it, and when reading, I think the participants were, well, in general, the students. First, they started, I think, with younger students in primary school, and then they extended it also to secondary school.
Yep.
And then, for me, the intervention is this program. They work with the Respect program.
Exactly.
And then one comparison was, I think, made by one of the students. So one of the more aggressive students said that the Respect program itself had not such a big impact on him, but maybe going to a prison or something like that would have been a more intense experience for him and would have had a bigger impact. So that would be the comparison.
Yeah. Anyone else ideas about the comparator in this case? Did someone else read it? Thanks very much, Selina. Dominica is also looking very puzzled, so maybe it's just too hard. Actually, Selina, in part you are right that there is some kind of a comparative dimension here, but basically in this case there is no comparator, right? So the point is that there was not really a control group in the sense of, you know, people or students participating in the study and people not participating in the study, because it was, first of all, very difficult to recruit someone who was not participating in the study and hold the sort of the effects against that group. And the second reason was that this was a qualitative approach where I was trying to probe the process of whether some transformation had changed or not. And in that far, you are right, Selina, that you know, this reflection of the students of whether it had an effect on them was helping me, you know, see whether it was connected to the program or whether something else potentially would have been, you know, more impressive for the students or could have had a bigger impact, basically, right? I think this already shows you that there's quite a spread in terms of, you know, how you can go about impact and what kind of approaches you can take in relation to studying impact. I would like to leave it at that for today and just give you a very short snapshot of what's awaiting you next week. Let me just share my screen and then we can close for today. Basically, the idea for next week is that we're moving from this idea of you know, just coming up with a theory of change to an actual measurement design, which will also include the feedback loop that Philip mentioned at the very beginning. It is also going to be about applying some of the stuff in more detail, as you've already started doing with the theory of change, but really thinking it through in relation to your course project, right? So this is going to be a bit of an entry, as always, a little bit of content and little bit of repetition as well to get you into the working mode. And then the main thing is really going to be build on your theory of change, develop your PICO in relation to your own course projects, and think about how you would want to assess the impacts or the outcomes that you're sort of the final social outcomes that you're promoting. Would it be in quantitative ways? Would it be in qualitative ways? What kind of, you know, questions would you be asking? What kind of dimensions are going to be relevant? And the most important thing is to link it back to the sustainability challenge of how you're making progress against that, right? Okay. So as usual, we started like 5 minutes late and we're overrunning by 5 minutes, but I wouldn't want to keep you for longer for today. So I'll say goodbye and a good evening, and then we'll see each other for the working sessions next week. And as I said, we're going to be picking up on the stuff that we just introduced, and then help you apply it to your own course projects in order to also calibrate, you know, is what we're doing actually the thing that is going to be most effective in addressing the sustainability challenge. So thanks everyone, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.